All right, we'll get started. Thank you for joining, everyone. It's 11 o'clock on the West Coast, 2 on the East Coast. My name's Amy Brown. I'm with AlphaStaff, and you're with me for a couple hours today, right? We're going to be talking about harassment and discrimination. And then this is recorded, so you'll be able to watch it whenever you'd like after the fact, show some other employees that were not able to attend. It is under our alphastaff.com website. And when you go to client resources, you'll see this and all the other trainings that we offer every month under the business training webinars. And while I'm speaking about our webinars, we'd love to hear from you. What are some topics that you'd like to hear? What's important to you? What new trends, questions you have with HR, workers' comp, any of the services that we provide here at AlphaStaff? We're always looking to continuously improve those webinars. So please reach out to your HRAM and let us know what topics you would like to hear. For the presenter today, that's me, Amy Brown. A little bit about me, I'm based in San Diego, California. I'm a native. I've been in HR 18 years. I can't believe it. It's crazy. But yeah, 18 years in HR, 14 years of those, I was a frontline HR manager. So I was where a lot of you guys were, right? Or I was working with you on a regular basis on training your managers, investigating harassment situations, holding them accountable to doing their jobs. So I think I'm a pretty good resource. I've been in your shoes. It's tough. Being a manager is definitely one of the toughest jobs I've ever had. Luckily now I'm on the other side, so I don't have to manage people, but it's enjoyable, but it is difficult. So I've got a lot of experience dealing with different personalities, how to motivate. So, we'll talk a little bit about that today. It's from a manager perspective. And then I do service the West Coast, which right now for AlphaStaff is our fastest growing market. So we're really excited to be out here, with our clients and hopefully the new clients, but obviously multi-state emphasis as well, because we do have clients all across the country, as well as I do. For our agenda today, it's pretty packed. I'm going to try to stay focused so we get out of here on time. We're going to talk about the law. Why are we here, right? And the laws that were designed behind why we're here. Definitely going to give you the definition of harassment and discrimination. I think most of us probably know it, but with everything going on, they can definitely be blurred. There's a legal definition, and then you hear, well, he harassed me, right? What does that mean? So we're going to really dive in to what that looks like in addition to the description and the definition. As part of this training, we also have to talk about bullying. It does happen. It's expensive. It's costly. You lose the people from it. So we're going to talk a little bit about what that looks like and how to hopefully curb that in your work environment. The impact of harassment. What does it really do? How does it affect employees physically, emotionally? What are the financial impacts, right? And then we're going to get into how to correct and prevent, because really that is the most important part, right? We want to talk about how to stop it from happening in the first place. That's by awareness and training, education. And then if someone does have a complaint, what do you do about it? How do you document, right? Especially to protect yourself and the company. So that's what our agenda looks like today. I'll be asking some questions in between to get you engaged and to get that interactive participation. So just a friendly reminder, this is a safe environment. I'm pretty transparent. I may be saying some things, we're going to talk about sex. We're going to talk about race. We're going to talk about some uncomfortable situations. So I just want everyone to know, there's no dumb questions. Please feel free to ask. Don't feel embarrassed. I can't see you, right? No one else can see you. No one knows who you are. But let's also maintain some confidentiality. Let's don't use names, right? If we are giving up examples, I'll be using hypothetical examples, some from actual case law, but most of them are just situations I've seen, I've heard, I've experienced, right? And really the most important thing I think the takeaway is, you may not agree with everything I say today, but the objective and your responsibility, especially as a manager, but also I think as a human being, right? We want to ensure that our workplace is fun, it's free. People can be who they want to be, because that's when we're going to have productivity, we're going to have creativity, and we're going to just be more successful overall, right? So really our responsibility with this information is to ensure that we're doing the best we can to promote and correct any kind of discrimination or harassment situations. And then, of course, we're ensuring that compliance with the law, right? So that's really the big takeaways, even if you don't agree with some of the tips I have or some of the situations that we talk about. After this training, like I said, we'll be sending out certificates as long as, well, we'll go over that later. I'll get certificates. For those that did maybe not sign in, I can speak to the managers at the locations. We can get a list. But besides the certificate showing that you went to this, really you'll walk away with the understanding of what harassment is, who can be a victim, how to identify and address inappropriate behaviors, because they're all across the board, right? You may think something's inappropriate while someone else doesn't. So we're going to talk about that. How to avoid illegal conduct through documentation, through training, prevention, how to manage that harassment-free workplace. Hopefully I'll give you some tips from a manager on how to be proactive, how to build that trust with your team so they come to you before it becomes a huge issue, right? Before it escalates and takes all your time that you have to spend retraining and investigating, right? We want to be proactive. And then, of course, how to respond, because there is a certain way we want to respond. We want to make sure we're responding confidentially. We want to make sure that we're also handling it appropriately and urgently, right? So there's some tips that we'll take away at the end of the training. Okay, why am I stuck? There we go. My little disclaimer, I'm not an attorney. I always wanted to be one, but nope, I'm not one. I'm an HR practitioner, right? So really, this is to inform, it's to really provide an effort of good HR guidance. It's all the years of experience I've had going to trainings, my education, I'm certified, right? I'm not perfect, but I think I'm a pretty good judge of character, can understand how to talk to people, have great emotional intelligence, right? So really, it's not legal advice. If anything does need to be escalated, you need more support, at AlphaStaff, we have it. So please reach out to your HRAM, you can reach out to me, and we'll get you what you need. But again, this is just a conversation to get it started, and anything that goes deeper than that, if there's some risk and exposure there, we'd love to talk to you one-on-one and get the advice that you really need. So let's get started. Let's start with part one, which is the law. So we're going to talk about both California and federal, because we're here for California, but there's some federal laws that we need to be aware of as well. So why are you here? I hope you don't feel like I'm torturing you or your supervisor's torturing you, but you're really here because the law, California, mandated managers, supervisors to be here, right? So the law did change this year to include someone who's conducts business in California that has more than 5 employees. So they lowered the bar, it used to be 50, and now it's 5. We'll talk a little bit about probably why they did that. So you're here because you either work in California, you're a manager, your business conducts business, or your organization conducts business here. And then, of course, the law came out in 2005 stating that we have to have this 2-hour training. It was revised in 2018 to include some other parameters. And the California Fair Employment Housing is the one who kind of organizes this. If there's a complaint, we'll ask to see certifications. What training did you do, right? So that's the one that's requiring the employees to attend this on a regular basis and making sure it's interactive. And I think another really important reason that you're here is because managers play a really important role. You're with your employees every day, you're on the ground, you know their emotions, you know their behaviors, you see things that other people don't see. And so you can, one, be the roadblock right away to make sure it stops. You can educate them to make sure they don't continue that behavior, right? So you're really on the front defense of preventing and stopping it from occurring. So, and educating. So it's really important that we educate you, give you the tools, so you can be that first line of defense to protect yourself and the company. So other reasons where the law started revision in 2018 is top trends, right? Here's my little speech on Me Too, Time's Up. This is why we're here, really. Even though this law has been out for quite a while, it obviously escalated in 2017 and 2018 with the Me Too movement, Time's Up, where you saw the faces that you see on the screen and many more. that were doing inappropriate behaviors, right? And basically a lot of high profile harassment claims, issues, financial impact, right? So I think due to all the attention it got, it basically made lawmakers say, wait a minute, we really need to stop and refocus and educate and make sure this is happening, right? So a lot of also with the revision of the law is that there was some confidentiality that was taken away. It used to be where if you fired someone or someone walked away from maybe a lawsuit of harassment, they got a settlement, right, and they were told they couldn't talk about it. Things like that are no longer happening now because of this new law, and the new norm is what I hate to call it, but that's really what it is it's where we're at now, right, where our social norms have changed, and it's more prevalent, unfortunately. It's more in our face. We hear it all the time, and so that's kind of where, again, the drop from 50 employees to 5 has changed in California and some of the other laws. So really, you know, today's environment, that if you sexually harass someone, you assault someone, whether it's an employee, a boss, a business contact, you know, your job, your company, it could be at risk. People are not going to take it anymore, right? And the standards have risen. We're educating, and that's kind of where we're at today and why the law's changed. It is the new norm. A lot of people say, well, really, is it? You know, what is going on with harassment? How come I don't see statistics? I don't hear about it. Well, it's hugely underreported. We'll talk a little bit about why, but just the statistics, upwards of 85% of people never file a formal legal complaint. You know, that's with an agency, right? EEOC, DFEH. They never say they never formally complain that there was any type of harassment. And then approximately 70% of employees never complain internally. So I think that's why things have been happening the way they were, right? It was pushed under the rug. People were afraid of their jobs, and they still are. But luckily with this Me Too and Time's Up, it's gotten people thinking, and it's more in the surface and then out in the open. So people are feeling more comfortable. And you're going to see those stats right now. People are feeling more comfortable coming forward and marking claims, right? So the EEOC is our federal government agency that mandates and kind of regulates the discrimination and retaliation or harassment. So in 2018, they had 7,500 harassment lawsuits that were filed. And out of the litigation and the enforcement, they were able to recover nearly $70 million. That's a lot of money for employees allegedly sexually harassing others, right? And as we talked about with this Me Too and people feeling more comfortable, there's not as much fear. It's increasing the number of charges filed. So you'll see that it's up 12% in 2018 from 2017. And professionals, lawyers, they only feel that those numbers are going to keep rising. Hopefully with this education and the commitment of people to make sure it's not happening, not being afraid, those numbers will go down, but we'll have to see. So those are our 2018 statistics. If you could use your chat box, what do we think the largest charge of discrimination and harassment in the United States is? So we have religion, we have sex, we have retaliation, we have age. What kind of charges, where do you think most of those charges are coming from? Age, gender, sex, age, very good. Sexual orientation. All right, let's see the answer. This is from 2018. We have retaliation, which is a form of discrimination. But you can see the other numbers aren't far behind, right? So we have sex at 24,000, disability at 24,000. So they're very close, disability, race, and sex, with retaliation leading the way. And that has been the trend for the last 5 years, is that retaliation, which we'll talk about. Retaliation is basically someone having an adverse impact on themselves for making a claim, right? I say someone sexually harassed me, maybe it was my boss, and now I got terminated. That's retaliation, right? So those are still continuing to be the largest charges, and something definitely that is a pretty high financial impact that employers need to be aware of. When we're looking at discrimination just in California, these are the 2017 statistics. Out of those complaints, now this discrimination agency also handles housing and employment. So they received 24,779 complaints, right? Out of those, which I was very shocked, only 4,300 were employment-based. But that's probably, again, maybe that fear, people don't want to come forward, right? It's a little bit more scary. So out of those complaints, only 4,300 were on the employment side. But out of the investigated complaints, when they did receive them, they did 19,000, right? As you can see down below how it kind of panned out in California. Out of those investigated, there was 880 that were settled, which most of the cases do get settled. And you can see a large dollar amount for settlement, right? And the most common discrimination was disability. We're seeing trends there with just as people are aging, there's more awareness of disability. There's definitely more protection. It's definitely, the accommodation is getting tougher. So a lot of people are starting to fear retaliation and discrimination based on those disabilities. That's a whole nother webinar that we'll have to talk about. But just wanted to put some real numbers, statistics, and most important, some dollar amounts that this is really serious. Not only do we want people to feel comfortable at work, but there's also some huge liability. I mean, this could bankrupt a company, right? So it's really important that we're taking this all seriously. So we've seen some stats. Let's talk about how we kind of got here, right? So here's some basic harassment and discrimination laws that have come through the years. So we have the basic Civil Rights Act of 1866 that gave men, regardless of race, the right to buy property. But as you probably recall, or if you're not history majors, men had most of the rights, right? And of course, they say regardless of race, but we know that wasn't always true. So in the 60s, that's when the civil rights really struck up, and that's when we have the Title VII. That really is I like to say, the foundation of the discrimination and the harassment. And that's saying that you cannot discriminate based on race, color, religion, sex, right? You'll see some things missing from there. And that's where we have these other laws that were created to protect those individuals. So in the 60s, later on in the 60s, we have age discrimination. That's for anyone over the age of 40. We have the Disabilities Act that it took a long time to get there, but basically people with disabilities, cancer, maybe you're deaf, maybe you're blind, all kinds of disabilities, right? That they cannot be not hired or fired because of that disability. We need to have the conversation about accommodation, right? So that came about in the 90s. And then also in the 90s, we had finally kind of the revolution that, hey, like, workplaces really do need to take responsibility. People are there 8-hour plus days. They need to feel comfortable, and the employer does have the right, or does have the obligation, I should say, to provide a workplace that's free of harassment. And then later in 2000, after kind of everyone was coming back from the wars, right, we had a lot of the military coming back, trying to acclimate and getting rejected, right, not being able to find work. Housing, maybe people didn't agree with what they were doing over in the military, right? So the USERRA Act was created to protect those employees that served in our military, to give them reemployment rights while they're out on active leave, and the hiring and making sure they're treated fairly as well. Some of the sexual harassment laws, particularly with California, we have three. We have the Assembly Bill 76, which says in California, employers are liable for any sexual harassment training that happens in the workplace. And this is including customers and vendors. We'll talk a little bit more about that, but it doesn't just have to be coworkers. Anyone who engages or interacts with your employees, again, going back to people have the right to have an environment free of harassment, right? You've got to think about who your employees are interacting with as well, and making sure they're held accountable somehow. We'll talk a little bit more about that. The code section 12950.1, that's where we got the original training in 2005, that employers with more than 50 or more have to have this training for every 2 years for at least 2 hours, right? And then a new supervisor within 6 months. And then the new one that just happened in 2019, the State Bill 1343. And that's where it expanded it. So not only do employers with 50 or more and managers need to be trained, we need to train everyone. This isn't just managers harassing people, right? These are just people that engage in a daily basis sometimes. So they extended it to 1 hour training for employees. And everybody needs to be retrained by 2020, which is most likely why you're here, right? So that's how we got here. Those are some of the laws behind why we're here, and specifically these three with this training that we're doing today. So we're talking a lot about supervisors, managers, and just want to, again, define that, because in California, it's pretty broad. The definition of a supervisor is usually someone who has the authority to obviously make decisions, right? Hire, fire, suspend, transfer, promote, demote, right? So you have the authority to really have an impact on someone's career, their financial stability, right, at the organization. They also have a responsibility where they're directing the employees' daily activities, right? So they're managing their success, they're counseling, they're giving feedback, right? That's their responsibility. But it's also someone who can recommend, right? So someone who may recommend to a supervisor that someone should be fired, they also could fall, and they do fall, in this definition of supervisor. And sometimes we see them called team leads or shift leads. So, please don't, some companies try to hide this supervisor role, or maybe extending some responsibilities or liability to someone who doesn't have that definition of a title of supervisor or manager. Well, in California, again, they're not going to look at the job title, what you're actually doing. And if you're any of my clients, we've talked a lot about that with classifications and, let's look at job descriptions, job duties, right? All go into this. Why it's really important that, titles are important, but it's really what are they doing? So think about that in your organization. If there's any restructure, needed, or more elaborate conversations, I'm sure HREM is definitely available for that conversation. So when we talk about discrimination, we're talking about protected categories. So that's where sometimes as a manager, you may hear, oh, he harassed me, or this is a hostile working environment. Well, what does that mean exactly, right? There is a legal definition of what that means. So when we talk about harassment, we always talk about, when it's unlawful harassment, we talk about the federal and the state protected categories. So these are the basics. In the federal, we have age, national origin, religious, disability. Most of these items you'll see, right? It's not something we choose. We don't choose our age. We don't often choose to be disabled. It happens. And which is why these things need protected, right? And protection, because it's not something we're just taking on ourselves. It's something that maybe happened to us, or we're born into. We're born a certain race, right? We can't change those things. So they need to be protected and respected. Now, California has even more protected categories, as you can see. We've got the basics as the federal, but from a manager perspective, you have to understand there's also HIV and AIDS. There's sexual orientation, transgender, breastfeeding. I'm proud to say I see a lot of these trends going into other states now. I would say a lot of states now have rights for breastfeeding mothers. The sexual orientation, the transgender, as I'm sure most of you know, that's become a really popular topic. How to accommodate, where do you even start, right? Gender identity. So these things are not just California anymore, but just obviously at a federal level, they haven't got there yet. They haven't reached and met where the states are going, right? So you do need to be aware of both. And when you're in a state like California, California laws will trump federal. Sounds kind of weird, but things that are more common in California, and if they're not common in federal, you do need to look at obviously both, but California will trump the federal, okay? So we have to be aware of those protected categories so we know what really is harassment. So I know you probably don't know the answer yet because I haven't given it to you, but just a little quiz. Employees or job applicants who believe they have been illegally harassed, because believe it or not, you can harass a job applicant. They don't have to be an employee. How much time do they have to file with the California Agency Department of Federal Fair Employment Housing? What do you think? Put in your chat box. How long do they have to file? 3 years? 90 days? What else do we got? 30 days, 2 years, 1 year. Mike Ellis, 1 year. Mike's been to my training lots of times, right? So 1 year, it is 1 year. So a lot of times people will say, hey, whew, I passed that one, right? They're out, they haven't filed anything, I'm good. Well, they do have 1 year to file a claim, right? So that's with the department, obviously in California. So just be aware, just because you think that you might have cleared out 30 days or 90 days or whatever, doesn't mean they can't always come back. So, what we want to do is avoid it altogether, right? But it is 1 year. Also want you to remember, I know there's going to be a lot today, but some of the really important takeaways, you as a manager can be personally sued, right? So, this isn't just, oh, I work for this employer and I should do the right thing. And yes, I'm a manager, I have some responsibilities. If you participated in harassment, you were kind of the roadblock to make sure it wasn't happening or prevent it, you could also be personally sued for that. So you're on the hook too. So that's another reason why, not only to do the right thing, right, as a human being, you want to treat people fair, but from a legal perspective, liability perspective, it's really important that you know that as a manager, you could be taken to court just as easily as the employer could. All right, true or false? So we're going to do this through the chat again, so bear with me. True or false? An employee can be harassed by a vendor or a customer. True or false? True, true, true. Very good. I try to make these pretty easy, so true, good. Number 2, if you have the authority to recommend a promotion or tell an employee what to do on a shift, you're defined as a supervisor in California. True or false? True, very good. Yeah, remember, you can recommend, that's the key word, right? You don't have to give that promotion, but if you're recommending to upper management or someone who is going to give that promotion, absolutely, you could be on the hook, and you are defined as a supervisor. Number 3, the most popular discrimination charge is retaliation. True, true, very good. And the last one, oh, I'm sorry, number 4, federal law has more protected categories than California. True or false? Oh, I gotcha, false. Good, everyone, okay, I want to make sure you're not just saying true. Yes, remember California does have a lot, several more. We're talking HIV, AIDS, pregnancy is also protected under California, gender identity, things like that. Very good. And then last but not least, true or false, you have 1 year to file that complaint if you believe you've been harassed. True, very good. All right, you passed that section. Okay, so let's get to part 2. Let's really talk about the meat of why we're here. So we talked about the laws, but let's talk about the definitions, what it looks like. I think it's pretty basic common sense, right? But again, when we're talking about legal definitions, because that's really what's going to be brought into if there's a claim, right? What is the legal definition of harassment and discrimination? So harassment is unwelcome, right? That's a key word. Unwelcome conduct that, again, is based on those protected classes we talked about, race, color, sex, age, right? It endures an offensive conduct, and it usually, not always, but it usually becomes a condition of continued employment. We'll talk a little bit about that. It doesn't always have to be employment, but usually, hey, if you don't, have sex with me, you're not going to get that job, right? You're not going to get that raise. That's how it looks with sexual harassment, right? There's a condition of employment, okay? But it also can be severe or pervasive enough. Maybe it's comments about age, right? You call someone, oh, funny dud. Oh, they don't know how to speak English very well. They're just old and they've been in the market for a while and they're just slow, right? Anything like that that's severe and pervasive that creates that unwelcome, it's intimidating, it could be obviously hostile and abusive, that is also harassment. We'll talk a little bit about those two different types later, but just an overall view, that's what harassment looks like and what it is. Now, discrimination is the treatment or consideration based on those protected classes, right? So it's not based on merit, it's not how hard you work, it's not what you've accomplished. It's basically, I'm not going to hire you because you can't speak English, right? Or I'm not going to hire you because you're not white. Or, you're not Mexican, and I hire a lot of Mexicans in the warehouse, and that white person would not feel comfortable working with all of the Mexicans, right? So it's just taking your protected class from just a physical view, right? And no merit, nothing else is in consideration except that protected class, right? And you're making a decision based on that. That is discrimination. We also have sexual harassment, very similar to harassment, but it obviously has that sexual connotation, right? So it's usually unwelcome sexual advances, requests for favors, verbal, physical, touching, leering, cat calls, whistles, things like that, right? And again, it's submissive to a condition of employment. So either I do this or I don't get that job, I don't get that promotion, I get demoted, right? It's also could be tied to an employment decision. And again, it could create that hostile working environment. So someone who's just intimidated and doesn't want to speak up and is harassed, on a constant level with physical, emotional, or mental. So when we talk about protection, just want to again outline the differences between the federal and state. I think I've kind of already done that, but just for people that learn differently, a different way to look at it. From the federal, the protection from harassment and discrimination is from Title VII, right? It's enforced by the EEOC. So we do have gender and sex, including childbirth, the religion, the color, the things we talked about. And then from the state level, we have the FEH that is protecting that and kind of housing those components and doing the investigations. And that's where you'll have the claims come out of, right? So again, they're looking at harassment based on sex or sexual nature. Same thing with federal, it could be pregnancy, childbirth, the gender, and then also can include any offensive behavior of the same gender of the harasser, right? So we'll talk a little bit about that. It doesn't have to be male versus female, it could be the same sex, right? And again, in California, because we love to do things different, we have the Assembly Bill 887 that was pretty progressive in its time, where it really talked about gender. And as part of the training, it wanted to have a piece of this in there, right? Where it talked about, because a gender is protected, what does that mean exactly? And so the two definitions I say we have would be the gender identity, and that's how an individual sees their gender, right? We have the expression, so I may see myself as female, but I want to dress as a male, right? So that would be the way I express myself. And as an employer, you need to accommodate as best as you can. And again, a further conversation, but if you do have an employee that wants to use, a different restroom than their gender or dress a certain way, and maybe it's causing some problems or conversations or concerns, we definitely want to address that and have a conversation because they have a lot of rights to do so. So again, this AB 887 requires employers to allow the employees to dress that they identify with either their gender or their identity. So more to come on that, I'm sure, but just a little intro on that's important to the training. So let's go back into the types of harassment. We have economical and environmental. There's two. They're called usually quid pro quo and hostile working environment. So the quid pro quo falls under the economical. The way to remember it is it's going to impact me financially, right? It's something for something in Latin, meaning that there's going to be a really adverse impact. It's a condition of employment if I don't meet the demands of the harasser, right? So I won't get a promotion if I don't have drinks with you, if you don't allow me to, if you make me dress a certain way, and if I choose not to, right, I may not get that pay increase, right? So again, just something for something, and that's the economical, where it is a condition of employment. And with this type of harassment, because it is that authoritative recommendation and decision adverse impact, this type of harassment is only a supervisor to a subordinate, right? So you don't usually see, and I don't think I've ever seen any, that are employee to employee. Because again, someone has to have the authority say, if you don't do this, I'm going to either recommend or I'm going to terminate you, right? So again, that's more of a supervisor to subordinate, whereas the environmental, which is the hostile working environment, is the one that's a little bit more common, I think, and it's also could be a little bit more secretive, because sometimes you don't realize it's happening. It could be something as simple as a calendar on the wall that someone has to look at that has suggestive or offensive pictures, right? Or a joke that goes around, whether it's in comment or via email. So it, again, creates that intimidating, hostile environment that people feel threatened. It starts affecting them emotionally, and they just don't know what to do. And of course, at that time, we'll talk about impact. The productivity shuts down. They're just on survival mode, right? So the environmental, AKA hostile working environment, could be seen as a verbal, physical, emotional, or sexual harassment. It can come out in different ways to talk about. Again, it can be severe or pervasive, right? Pervasive meaning over time, severe, it's just one time. And again, it has to be, I didn't say again, but one important takeaway is that the definition of offensive is offensive to a reasonable person. So we may have someone that gets very offended by hugging, and to a reasonable person, hugging is not offensive, okay? So that may not fit that definition at that time. But if it's something that goes alongside the hugging, right, that could be seen as offensive. So that would be a simple definition of what could be offensive to a reasonable person. But when the courts are going through this, or there's a settlement and there's litigation, they're definitely looking at what would a reasonable person do. So that's one of the defenses as an employer that can be aware of, and definitely make sure that we have that angle and we're educating and preventing that. So who can be affected by this? Will a peer, a supervisor, a subordinate, a vendor, again, anybody involved in a hostile working environment. Doesn't have to be just a supervisor to a subordinate. This is where you see a lot of employee, coworker hostility, right? Or outside vendors, clients, people that you engage with on a regular basis. So severe and pervasive, severe, I think we all kind of know what that is. Things like assault, rape, grabbing, forcibly kissing, forcing someone against a wall, blocking them, right? Something like that, severe intimidation, that's going to fit the definition of severe. While pervasive, it may not be those things. You might not have forcibly kissed someone, but maybe over time you've been doing kissing gestures, right? And it happens very frequently. And it's happened so often that the employee doesn't even want to go near that employee anymore. And they're avoiding them altogether because they know what experience they're going to have, right? So that would be a definition of pervasive, constantly happening, even though it's not severe, to the definition of forcibly kissing someone. So again, going back to the chat box, let's talk about the harassment. So we have the quid pro quo, environment or economical, and we have the environmental, which is the hostile working environment. So let's talk about the first one. A supervisor tells an employee in his department that she can have that raise with him. Is that economical or environmental? Or quid pro quo, whichever you feel more comfortable with. Quid pro quo, hostile, whichever you feel comfortable with. Perfect. You guys are good students. Economical, very good. The second one, an employee refuses a supervisor's sexual advances, which causes the supervisor to negatively alter his working hours. Is that quid pro quo, environmental, hostile, economical? I see a dollar sign, I like it, good. Economical, perfect. Let's see, constant use of sexually provocative or obscene language. What does that look like? Hostile, quid pro quo, environmental, economical, perfect. Hostile, environmental, good. And then last but not least, a continuous sexual proposition to an employee, even without directly tying the employee's response to an advance of employment. So again, going back to some of the things we talked about, it doesn't have to tie back to that advancement, but just, you're directly doing it, right? It's continuously happening. Very good, hostile, yep. And the key word there is continuous, right? Anything continuous that's happening over time, and its sexual nature, that could be seen as hostile working. Very good. Okay, let's see. So let's get into what it looks like, harassment. Want to give you some definitions. So physical, whether it's harassment or sexual, right? But this is what it would look like: touching, pinching, patting, grabbing. We even have hazing, right? Requiring an employee to wear sexually suggestive clothing. So again, pretty common. And again, you might say, well, these are all touching. I guess touching would be the example, right? Really, if I touch someone, that's harassment. Well, it's one, got to be unwelcome, right? So we'll start there. And then two, again, it depends, right? What does the person want? If it's unwelcome, yes, and it continues to happen, that could be construed as sexual harassment. One or two times, if you're touching the shoulder, I guess it depends on where you're touching, right? Touching someone's butt, absolutely, right? That's offensive, severe, not acceptable. Again, unless I guess if it's welcome, but that's a different situation, right? We shouldn't be doing that in the workplace. We'll talk a little bit more about that. But this is unwelcome touching, that's inappropriate. Those would be examples of physical or sexual harassment. Sexual harassment, again, kissing, unwanted intercourse, so that, that's rape, basically, assault, exposing someone's self, talking about fantasies, some gossip. Yes, it's gossip, but if it's sexually suggestive and you're spreading rumors about someone and it's creating a reputation, absolutely that's sexual harassment. Calendars, pictures, jokes, devices that you bring to work, or you're talking about sexually explicit details of your sex life. Again, if you're doing that with certain people, maybe that's not harassment because they want to hear that. But I think the overall theme here is that's not appropriate for work, right? So just because it's welcome, do we really need to talk about those things at work? Because a third party could walk in and overhear that and be offended, right? So we want to remember that even though I use the legal definition of unwelcome, we really shouldn't be talking about these things at work. So if you're overhearing your employees talk like this, please pull them aside and let them know, hey, unacceptable, inappropriate, unprofessional. Let's keep that, breaks. Let's keep it off site, things like that. Verbal. So we've got name calling, belittling. We've got some sex thrown in there, right? Because that obviously could come into a verbal play. Cell phone rings could be offensive. Maybe we have Baby Got Back or something playing, or I don't know, something else that's very suggestive to someone's body parts, right? Calling someone sweetie, honey. That also could be very patronizing and offensive and make someone feel belittled, right? So we want to make sure, even if we're commenting on someone's hair or the way they look, it could make someone feel uncomfortable, right? I hate to say it, but with the Me Too movement, we had a lot of conversation about, wow, I can't compliment someone on the way they look anymore. Again, I would hate to say you can't, because I know most people enjoy getting those compliments, right? It makes you feel good. But I think you have to be very sensitive. And I think we'll talk a little bit more about it. What is the impact? What is the perception, right? So I think you need to know your audience before you make comments like that. But just know that if you don't know your audience and you tell someone, wow, that dress looks really nice on you, it really, shows off your figure, someone could be offended by that, right? And so they could report you, or someone as an employee comes to you, right, as a manager, and now you're having to kind of have a conversation about why that's not appropriate. So again, different layers of harassment, but just want to make you aware of some of the most common things, how they start and how they can progress to become harassment. A lot of these things are innocent conversations, comments, and they kind of get out of control and somebody gets offended. Visual harassment. So again, we have pictures, objects, staring at someone, leering, looking someone up and down, gestures, all those things, again, unwelcome, unwanted, and really unprofessional in the work environment. They should not be happening. Even if two people are dating, which we'll talk a little bit about later, they shouldn't be doing things like this, sharing love letters and sending sex texts or whatever they're called, sexting, right? They shouldn't be doing that in the work environment because it's just inappropriate and it's not productive, and you should be focusing on work, right? So those are things that you might have to have a conversation with employees about if they are dating or in a relationship. Visual harassment can also be things like this, right? We've got the old school Redskins, where, you know, again, a lot of the teams are going through what's appropriate, what's not, you know, as we become more sensitized to what's happening in pop culture. So having a sign like this at work could be offensive to someone, and it could be a sign of harassment if you allow it to continue. Someone wearing the Confederate flag, right, could also be offensive. And the way to get around stuff like this is maybe you have a policy where you can't wear t-shirts, right, with offensive things on there, or things that are not, that could be offensive, like politics or pictures, or things that, again, that are create some sensitivity and depolarizing, right? Put those in your job descriptions, or sorry, not your job descriptions, your policies, right, for attendance and appearance. And also like the way you decorate your office, right? Things that you can have at your desk, right? Things like that you can have where it has to be professional manner, just pictures and things like that. All right, so I think we have a question or maybe a comment. What about a cross hung on the wall? Very good. Again, you know, it could be offensive. I think the safe answer is that you don't allow things like that in the office, but that's not always the right answer, right? So I think it's a decision that the company needs to make. And if someone is offended, they may have to have a conversation about why it's just not appropriate here. Now, if it's a necklace or something, that may be different, but, you know, depending on how large it is and how many people see it, I think that could, you know, that could be a problem. So good question. What is discrimination? So we talked about harassment. Let's talk about discrimination. It's an unlawful, where it pertains to the employment. So it could be hiring. So we talked a little bit about the applicant, right? Where they're not even hired, or maybe they don't even get an interview, and they feel like it's because they are in that protected category and you found out about it, right? Maybe example, a resume. A lot of resumes, they've shown stats that if they tell the gender or the ethnicity of someone's name, sometimes they won't get even a phone screen because they have preconceived bias about that religion or that ethnicity or that gender, right? So unfortunately, it could become before they're even employees, but obviously once they're employees, there's other discrimination that could come from promotions, not getting a promotion, being terminated, not getting adequate training, not allowing time off. So maybe someone takes Fridays off because that's their religion, right? They celebrate their holiday on the Friday, their religious holiday, I should say, on the Friday, and you're not allowing that time off. That could be a problem, depending, right? We got to talk about accommodation. That's a big issue that we have to take offline. But again, if you're not even looking at accommodating or having a conversation about it, and you're just saying no, that's where the problem lies. A lot of this is just, let's engage more. Help me understand what you want. You know, going back to the cross, help me understand why that's important. Where do you want to hang it? Who's going to see it? You know, looking at things from all angles, not just black and white, right? So discrimination is basically, again, saying that you cannot make a personal decision based on these protected classes. Injury, had to fill position, disability discrimination. So Dan, injury, had to fill position, disability. Saying that someone's out on disability maybe, and you had to fill the position. So it depends on the accommodation. I don't know if I understand all of it, but with discrimination, so I'll just take an example of if somebody is on disability leave, and maybe it's protected by FMLA, right? We don't want to just instantly fire them because they're not coming back, right? Because there could be some other disability rights that they have after FMLA expires. They could be protected under the Disability Act, right? So again, it's having that engaged conversation, they call it interactive conversation, about what accommodation, how, you know, is this a financial hardship for the company? Are we large enough, etc. So that's a good question that definitely I would ask your HRIM. They can get into more details. So I'm trying to advance my slide. Okay, so discrimination. So I hate to be the bearer of bad news, but I think we all know, right? Unfortunately, discrimination is it's around us all the time. And a lot of times we call it shaming, right? Where we look and judge people. We tend to flock to people who are like us. We make decisions daily that we have to kind of say, hey, what are we going to do with this situation, right? Yes or no? I mean, we're faced with so many decisions. We're interacting with so many people that unfortunately it is a learned condition. We learn it from our parents or from people that raise us, right? It's environmental, and it is something that we all have to struggle with, and we need to be aware. So really what this slide is saying is, you know, I don't want to say, oh, you discriminate or you're biased and that's a bad thing, right? Because I think initially and looking as a person, we all do that because we do tend to judge people, right? We flock to people that we have things in common with. We hire people that we feel are going to fit in our culture, right? Is a perfect example. But where it goes wrong and where it's illegal is where we only use that as the determination of you know, hiring someone or making a decision, right? And so what this slide is trying to say is that be aware that there is some discrimination, all of us, that we have that learned condition, and it sometimes is a struggle for more than others to examine their own biases, right? Educate your own employees on those biases, especially when we're hiring or we're training or we're integrating cultures, because we understand that we need to do that. We should be doing that as a productive organization. Having differences of cultures, people, skills, knowledge, that's where you're going to be successful, because where someone lags, someone else can come in and be successful at that behavior or that characteristic, right? So that's why we don't want to always hire everyone that fits our culture. We might want to hire someone who is a little different, maybe a little bit more assertive or a little bit more aggressive, but we still feel that can fit the role into the culture, if that makes sense, right? You've got to have a balance. So what I'm trying to say is we don't want to always hire everyone that looks like us or everyone that is the same, because one, that could be illegal, right? It could appear that you're discriminating. And also, as a company, you're probably not going to be productive because you're not going to have different perceptions, perspectives. You're not going to have that creativity, that awareness, that open-mindedness, because everyone's going to think the same. And so as a company, statistics show when you do that, you're not as successful, you're not as productive. People don't want to work and be associated with companies like that because it doesn't give a good example, right? And show that you are open to hiring and diversity, right? So really what we want to do is refuse to allow it. And so by doing that, it's through this training, is having people know where their biases are and talk through it. A lot of times it comes with interviewing, right? So telling them, hey, if you always feel that working moms, right, won't be able to work past 5 o'clock, that's a bias. And so you need to examine that and talk it through, and where are your biases, right? And ask more questions in the interview process. You can make sure that this working mom can really stay after hours if necessary, right? And of course, don't discriminate if she can't. Don't not hire her for that. There may be another legit reason, right? Let's see, we have a question. Yes, I can talk more about pregnancy discrimination. Hopefully I won't forget. I just want to make sure I stay on target. Thank you. Because I don't want to go over. Harassment and technology. So harassment technology, I think we all know it happens, right? We all use technology all the time. Most importantly is that it cannot be deleted. If you get an inappropriate email, text, whatever, we don't want to resend it. We want to give it to the appropriate person, right? And say, hey, I got this, or I saw this, right? And most importantly, we want to think carefully before we send any kind of message that we feel could be offensive, right? And it could be your tone, it could be the way you're, you know, obviously what you put in it, but just making sure that, you know, you're being cautious, you're slowing down, you're rereading that email, but knowing that harassment can't happen that way. And that as a company can be responsible and held liable if you're not putting those practices into place, right? And educating your employees that that's not acceptable. Sorry, my thing keeps getting stuck. Does it have to happen at work? No, it could happen at a customer's work site, right? So again, if your employee is on your time delivering something or going to visit a client, and again, this example is cyberspace, it still is your responsibility to protect them. So my example here I usually always use is, this was at my work site, so I'll use kind of a vendor situation, but I used to have an employee that was a receptionist, and the UPS used to come in every day, of course, to deliver the packages, and he thought my employee was very attractive. She was young, they probably flirted, had a good conversation, right? And when he finally asked her out, and she said no, he did not take no for an answer. And just, as he came in daily, it started to become really uncomfortable, right? And so it was my responsibility, even though he was not my employee, it was my responsibility to protect my employee. So I had to have that uncomfortable conversation with the UPS guy that what he was doing was inappropriate, it was unprofessional, it had to stop, and I would be following up with his supervisor. And that's what I did. So that's just one example, and that obviously happened at my work site. But obviously, if it happens off-site and your employee comes back and tells you something that happened, you still want to make sure that you're having a conversation, getting all the facts, and then following up with whatever recourse you need to, because it still is your responsibility, and there could be some liability if you do not. And the same with cyberspace, right? You want to make sure that someone's getting bullied on Facebook, or maybe even what am I trying to say? Direct messaging that you have in-house, right? Those could still be, grounds for getting written up, and also for harassment. So what matters most, intentions or perception? What do you think? Is it the intent, or is it the way someone takes it? Let's use the chat. What do you think? Is it what I'm doing, or is it the perception? The way someone takes it, perception. Very good. The correct answer is perception, right? You could have all the good intent in the world, but if someone perceives it wrong, and that's where harassment goes crazy. That's why it's really hard sometimes to manage, because there are so many people that have different sensitivities, right? And they may be more, they may take something more offensively than somebody else, right? And so that's where kind of the rule is, let's just not have these conversations in the first place. It's so hard to regulate what somebody is going to, how they're going to react to something. Why don't we just have a policy or the conversation about, hey, all these behaviors are inappropriate, right? You may not think it's offensive, but let's don't even have these conversations at the water cooler, because it's going to create some uncomfortable talks, especially politics, right? It's probably the biggest one that, we've seen some complaints. I've heard some from my clients that they're talking and, hey, it's just, a simple conversation about the news or what's going on, but it starts getting built up and personalities start to differ, right? So again, it's really the victim's perception, and that's what they're going to look at in the legal definition of harassment is, how did the victim take it, not what the person that gave the behavior was trying to accomplish, right? Or what the intent was. So we talked about behavior. Again, what is unwelcome behavior? We gave you some of those examples, but really it could be an employee complaint. It could be a verbal response or lack thereof. So if someone's ignoring someone, that could be seen as unwelcome behavior. Body language, expression changes, avoidance. So all of a sudden, if one of the employees is being not invited to certain meetings or maybe conversations, right? That could be seen as unwelcome behavior and could be harassment. So we want to be aware of small things like this that may not, they're not harassment like from the beginning, but if they continue and if they're not dealt with, then definitely it could elevate to that, right? So that's why it's good just to say these are not good behaviors to practice in the workplace, right? Your body language does say what you're thinking, even if you don't know it. So please, if you're annoyed, don't present it like that in your body language, right? We talked a little bit about this earlier, who are potential harassers. Again, it can be really anybody, and employers are liable if they knew about it or should have known, right? We'll talk more about that in the prevention. and failed to stop it. So, really, that's where that conversation, that trust, that proactive management that we're going to talk about really comes into play, because you need to know what's going on maybe before it even happens, because you could stop it and have a conversation and make sure the harassment keeps occurring. Who's the victim? It could be the witness of the behavior. It could also be the target of the behavior. And it could be just a third party that walks into the conversation, right, and overhears it. So a lot of different players when you're having conversations and when behaviors are unwelcome that you may have to investigate when you do get to that section of the conversation. I'm looking at the chat, sorry guys. Okay, so who's liable? Employers. When you are liable is when it's a direct definition and obvious quid pro quo or hostile working environment, or when an employee suffers a tangible employment action because of the supervisor's conduct, right? So maybe the supervisor didn't do anything about it. They just batted an eye, didn't know what to do, couldn't do anything about it, their hands were tied. That also is when you would be liable, right? That's why the managers are being trained, because a supervisor's conduct could also put the employer at a lot of liability. So supervisors, again, if they fail to engage, respond, or monitor, they're seen as agents of the organization in California, and they're held to a much stronger, higher standard. So that's why, again, they could be held liable, because you are an acting agent, you have authority, you have, the permission to make decisions, right? And if you fail to monitor or engage, ignore, that's when you can be held liable. So just another, again, a lot of these slides kind of say the same thing, but just to get a different perspective. Relationship, the type of harassment, and where the employer's liability is. So what I'd like to point out is that if the employer did not know, and you can prove that you did not know. So the biggest kind of thing I get is where someone gets fired or they leave. It's probably more that they leave, right? Maybe something was going on, the employer was unaware of it, and the employee quits because they just don't want to deal with it. And as they're leaving, they tell you this was occurring. It was very hostile. I was intimidated. The manager yelled at me. I just did not feel comfortable. And there's a lot of stuff that you did not know going on, right? I'm sure some of you heard those conversations. So that's where, if you can really prove it, that you did not know, you should be off the hook, right? If that employee comes back with a lawsuit. But here's where you gotta do something about it, right? Because now you do know. And if you need to take that information, as much as you can get from that employee leaving, and now go do an investigation, right? And that's gonna be some good follow-up to if that employee leaving does file a suit or file a claim, right? You can show, hey, we didn't know about it until August 8th when Amy reported it to me, and here's what we did to investigate and find out what was going on, and then here's the the outcome of that, right? So this is just another little screenshot of how an employer is liable in certain situations. So let's talk about the different harassments. Again, we have quid pro quo, we have hostile. So Samuel is Melanie's manager. They're working together on a project, and he says, perhaps if we collaborate on this project, I can make things easier for you at your next evaluation. So again, it could be open-ended, but his tone, right, makes Melanie think, she's insinuating what he means by collaborate. What type of harassment is that? Quid pro quo, very good. Quid pro quo, sexual harassment, very good. Quid pro quo, okay. The next one, all right, my slide's not advancing. There we go, quid pro quo. All right, Peter and Josh work at a manufacturing facility, and there's people of all races and ethnicities, but a supervisor there continuously refers to the Latinos as beaners. And Peter and Josh are white. They've complained multiple times to management about how they don't like that language. And the management says, well, you're not even Latino, so it doesn't matter. Until a Latino complains, it doesn't matter, just move on, right? That's pretty much what he's saying. What do you guys think about that? Which type of harassment is that? Hostile, very good. Hostile or environmental? Okay. John, who is 54, works for a high-profile tech company, and he's got excellent reviews, but he's often called slow, sluggish, funny-duddy behind his back, right? So after working there for a year, John is fired for not being a good cultural fit. What type of harassment is that? Age, that's right, it is age harassment. Does it fall into environmental or quid pro quo? Environmental, very good. But yes, absolutely, John would have a really good case for age discrimination, right? Age harassment. He was fired for that. They're gonna have to prove that he wasn't, right? During a meeting with Carmelita, her boss says, why don't you wear shorter skirts like those women on TV? You're an attractive girl, and if you show some legs, our customers will be happier. A little dedication on your part would go a long way. So he's obviously suggesting she needs to wear certain clothes. What type of harassment is that? Sexual, yep. Environmental. Very good. Sexual, environmental, very good. All right. We have hostile working environment. Okay, so we're going to move on to section 3, and I'm just going to keep going because I think I'm running a little late, so I apologize. Again, I'll try to get to the questions, but let's start with bullying. Sorry, my mouse is not working. So, Assembly Bill 2053 was added to this training in 2015 that all employers must train on what they call abusive conduct, which is bullying. Statistics show 1 in 3 employees will experience it, so it's pretty common, and it costs businesses a lot of money, $200 billion a year, and that's mainly lost productivity, increased absenteeism, and high turnover. And as you can imagine, you're probably losing some really good people, right? Which obviously the productivity, the training, the rehiring, you lose talent, right? So that all plays into that. So here are some examples of what the legal definition of abusive conduct is. It's got to be repeated. It needs to be derogatory remarks or insults. It's verbal or physical. It definitely is like sabotaging where it undermines the work performance or just the work that the individual has done. And it cannot be a single act. So you can't just go off the rails and yell at someone and that's considered abusive conduct unless that single act was severe and egregious enough, right? So usually the abusive conduct that we see that, again, not a lot of lawsuits on this, but just the conversations in the HR world are usually that they're hostility, right? It's something that is pervasive and just keeps happening over and over again. So I wanted to give you some examples of what that bullying behavior could look like. There's 3 different categories that I created here where it's either the communication, right? So people are yelling, shouting, kind of what you figure a bully would be. They're finger pointing, they're communicating really rough in the emails, right? And making insults. The other part is where they're manipulating work. So maybe they are taking away tasks from someone because they're threatened, right? They're making unmanageable workload and impossible deadlines for someone to achieve so they can look better or to intimidate, right? They're leaving out people of emails, so they're lost. They don't know what's going on, right? Changing tasks, again, to make that person feel unorganized, unproductive, like they're emotionally going crazy, right? They can't keep up. Again, that hostility, that intimidating environment, that's what the manipulation of work, along with humiliation, where they're teasing, they're ridiculing, they're spreading gossip, they're ignoring people. So those are some of the behaviors that we see when it comes to bullying. Some examples, again, they could be just like the other harassment, verbal, social, cultural. You could bully someone on the way they speak English. Maybe they have a thick accent, right? Maybe there's some hazing going on with new hires and you're taking their belongings and hiding them or embarrassing them, right? And teasing. So a lot of different examples across the board when it comes to bullying. And often I get asked, well, how do you know if it's harassment or bullying, right? Because technically bullying isn't, I didn't see a lot of lawsuits. cases that have come to courts, right? Where there's like the definition of, okay, here's what, it looks like, and is there financial impact? In regards to a court case, right? We know there's unproductivity and emotional concern. So what I found is they look at, one, is it a protected category, right? So if you're saying someone's being bullied and it's not due to a protected category, they're just bullying because they're just a jerk and they're trying to intimidate someone, then that's just flat out bullying. That's not harassment, right? If it's, they're going to look at repetition. Repetition in harassment does not need to be required, but for the bullying category, it does, right? Again, unless it's severe or egregious. Also, the power imbalance. In harassment, it's not required, right? Remember, with the hostile working environment, we don't have to have that power imbalance, but it usually does occur. But with bullying, the legal definition, it definitely has to occur, okay? So again, these are going to tell you if you're struggling with, you should always take it seriously, but what's my exposure? What's my liability? And is this harassment? Should I really look into this more deeper and be more concerned? Or is this just I need to deal with it, right? So again, the subjectivity and the perpetrator. So again, the harassment and the bullying, and you can see they look very similar, which is why I thought this slide was a really good addition to the training. So another thing that gets people confused is it conflict? Is it bullying? What is it? So again, another definition. Bullying, again, we have where someone has perceived power. The intent is to harass, to embarrass, it's to control, and it's repeated. Whereas conflict is just two people not getting along. They're disagreeing. They're probably being professional, but maybe it's escalated a little bit. They're trying to solve a problem and they want to work together, but they can't, right? Because they're not seeing eye to eye. And hurting each other is not the main goal. So I think this is much easier to see. If you're ever questioning, like, is this bullying? Should I be concerned? I think conflict and bullying is very easy to see the difference because there's not that power, there's not the embarrassment, there's not that hurt, okay? So how do you handle bullying? Well, as a manager, you want to evaluate the situation, obviously get the two people together, investigate, ask questions. What is the root of the problem, right? Why, is this bullying first, right? Is it harassment? Is it conflict? But for this situation is bullying, so we want to evaluate it. We want to encourage employees to stand up for themselves. So we're going to talk a little bit more about this, but we're in a place now that people need to stand up. They need to address problems. They need to bring it to attention. It's great to go to a manager, but a manager is not always going to be there. So we want to teach our employees and encourage them to stand up for themselves and have a professional, rational conversation with that other employee. Hey, what you said hurt me, or the way you're talking to me is not acceptable and it's unprofessional. Please don't raise your voice when you're talking to me, right? That's kind of an example of what we want to teach our employees to do. Because as managers, we're not babysitters. We shouldn't be having to fight the battles for our employees. We should educate and train and give them the confidence and the autonomy to stand up for themselves, right? And again, that's my personal opinion, but I think it goes pretty far when it comes to management styles. So I would suggest that. We obviously want to document, because if it does get out of hand, if you do need to fire someone, if we are trying to say, look, this wasn't harassment, it was bullying, we always want to document, what took place and how you handled it, just like any other investigation, right? If you need to get upper management involved, absolutely, maybe HR, maybe someone else that's not as close to the situation that can see it a little bit more objectively, we should also do that. And then finally, maybe to handle it is to have an honest conversation with the employee and they need to move on. And what I mean by that is, I'll give my personal example. I had a supervisor that was pretty tough. He was very type A, direct. I'm warm and fuzzy. I like to talk a lot and have conversations and be, kind of feel it out. And he was just, nope, here's how we're going to do it. When, I felt like he wasn't listening to me, things like that, right? And it was hard for me to work with someone like that. It was basically different work styles. And I don't think he was bullying me, but I think it could be perceived as bullying. And I just had to come to a fact that, look, if you're going to be successful in this organization, he's not going anywhere, right? I need to figure out if I can handle this and work with him, or maybe I need to move on to someplace different. And that's what I did, is I decided to take the high road and I moved on and, we're friends and everything's great. But I just want to make it where not everyone's always in the right place, in the right bus, let's say, the right seat, right? There might be a different organization, there might be a different role. I know those conversations are tricky and hard, but sometimes it's honest, and people do appreciate honesty, and maybe they're thinking the same thing and they're just scared to hear it, right? So as a manager, I think that's something you could put in your arsenal of tools, and a conversation piece that maybe you need to have kind of engage with them in that direction and see how they take it. So last but not least, before we move on, 5 steps to handling the conflict. So let's say it's not bullying, it's just conflict. Again, I think as a manager, you can get everyone together and make sure everyone, realizes that everyone's intentions are good, right? We're all trying to solve a problem. We just see it as there's different ways to do it. And hey, I appreciate that, right? That's good creativity. That's good challenging each other to be better, right? There's always some way to do something, but there could be a better way to do it, right? So I think realizing that, encouraging it, and making sure that you're not solving the problem. Sometimes the employees need to come to the table with the problem, right? And an answer to that problem, a solution, right? So again, training your employees to kind of think for themselves, and you can be that mediator. You can say, hey, what's the problem? Let's encourage an in-person conversation. Let's get together. Let's realize that we're all trying to solve the same thing, but we're just having some problems doing it, right? And hopefully that will help mitigate some of the frustration, and you can kind of move on from that conflict. I won't spend a lot of time there because it's kind of off topic, but just wanted to talk a little bit about conflict because it does come up with bullying. So let's open the chat. Is this behavior bullying? Number 1, expressing differences of opinion. Is that bullying? Can you do so? No, absolutely you can do that, right? I mean, differences of opinion, I encourage that, right? And that's not bullying. What about offering constructive feedback? As a manager, can I give you guidance and advice? And as long as it's work related, am I okay to do that, or is that bullying? Yes, I can do it. Perfect. So it's not bullying. Good. What about intimidating a person? That's absolutely bullying. Yes. Not good. Yes, absolutely. We don't want to intimidate, right? We want to have a conversation where we're professionals and we're motivating. As a manager, you always want to motivate your employees, and you have to figure out how to do that, right, with each personality. And it's not by intimidating, I tell you. And then number 4, constantly changing work guidelines for no reason. Yes, it could be. I like that answer. This is kind of a gray area. When I put it in, I was like, oh, do I know the answer to this? Is it clear enough? But I would say you definitely want to be sensitive to that. If you see it, or someone brings it to your attention, I think it encourages a deeper dive, because it could be, especially if there's not a good work decision base behind it, right? If operations are changing and things are changing, absolutely. If there's, but if it's a personal thing and there's a boss just doing it to do it, that definitely can be considered bullying. So. Okay, the impact. So we've talked about the definition, the laws. What exactly does harassment look like, right? And what does it do to our organization? Why do I care besides the liability standpoint? Well, when you see somebody in your organization that all of a sudden, especially if they're a great performer, right? They're starting to call out sick, they're avoiding people, they're moody, they're becoming more shy, more distant, and especially if you see a decline in their performance, as a manager, that's when you start asking questions. I talk about this a lot in my other trainings. It doesn't even have to be harassment. You should be asking because you're concerned, right? And as a good manager, you want to know what's going on in your employee's life. Now, I know that could be a tricky situation there. We don't want to get too personal, but what if someone's going through a divorce? What if someone's, got some huge financial situations, right? You want to ask these questions because 1, you want to make sure it's not harassment, but then also, what if they're eligible for a leave of absence? What can you do as an employer? Maybe you can accommodate. Someone could take some time off or work a part schedule, right? You got to find what fits your organization and that employee. But by avoiding it, I can guarantee you're going to have a disgruntled employee, you're going to have an unproductive employee, and you could have a lawsuit because there could be some things going on. So we don't just always want to assume, right? But I would say if you see any of these signs, they could be harassment, but they could also be something else personal going on, that you could also be on the hook for, other things that you should be giving your employee access to, when I say like a leave of absence or something. So what is the effect at work? All across the board, right? We always think lawsuits, we think money, but also just it's expensive to mitigate these, right? Almost all of these cases settle, and usually we're seeing settlements at 30 to 40,000, right, to start. But it also impacts your current employees, right? You start losing good employees, so they have to take on the workload. They're working more, so now they're not as productive, or the quality goes down because their bandwidth has shrunk, right? And now they're starting to call out sick, right? There could be some safety issues if you're in manufacturing, or they're doing certain jobs where if they're being reckless and they're cutting corners, right? So then as you start losing people, how are you going to get new people to work? If you're a company that has a reputation, that is in the high profile, like we hear about Starbucks, where they've had incidents, or Uber, right? Where your reputation your image is really important. And by having a lawsuit or claim of harassment against you is huge, right? So again, making sure that we're not just thinking financial from a lawsuit perspective, but how it really does impact all of the organization. Start losing good people and you can't attract new people. Effects of harassment on victims, anywhere from physical to emotional, personal dignity. Again, we start seeing that decline on their performance, but also just their self-esteem goes down, right? Which they might not speak up in meetings. They might not take on other projects because they don't have the confidence, right? So those are some of the effects. And I think we all ask ourselves, why do people do this at work? Like, duh, come on. I mean, it's just crazy, right? But you'll hear it all the time. I didn't think that was inappropriate. Didn't bother me. Everyone does it here. We're a family organization. We're small. We have like brother and sister. We just joke like this, right? So there's a lot of excuses, and really it's about accountability, and it starts from the top and it kind of trickles down, and we all have to hold each other accountable, but obviously leadership has to be involved, and management, right? That's where supervisors need to be aware of the behavior and make sure that we're educating and ensuring that's not happening. Some more statistics about lawsuits. An average of 450 are filed daily in the United States. Of course, California leads the nation with employment law claims. And again, unfortunately, when you're sued, most of the time the company will lose, at least 50% of the time, I should say. And I see a lot more settlements. And what I'm also seeing is that, it costs a lot to settle. So the moral of the story there is, let's don't even get into it, right? Let's try to be proactive. Let's stop the behavior before and do a good investigation and document to protect that from having to go into a lawsuit. Like we talked about earlier, for the first time, not really the first time anymore, but retaliation is surpassing race-based complaints. So it is a big deal. So as a manager, you need to know what retaliation is. We talked a little bit about it earlier, where if you have an employee that has a complaint for you, especially with harassment or discrimination, got to be that definition right. And now they have a negative impact, a demotion, they're disciplined for it, their job changes all of a sudden, there could be some correlation, right? And so that's where there could be some retaliation. You don't have to fire them for them to have retaliation and for them to file a claim against you. You could just demote them or discipline them. So we want to make sure that someone who has filed a complaint is treated fairly, and I hate to say it, but maybe a little bit more gingerly, right? But at least having the documentation, if you do have to counsel them for something they've done, making sure that it is not related to that claim. We'll talk a little bit more about it, that complaint, I should say. So as an organization, as a manager, you definitely want to make sure zero tolerance. What does that mean? Again, it's just making sure that managers across the board know, employees know that retaliation will not be tolerated. We want an open environment. We want you to feel comfortable coming to us with any complaint, big or small, and we'll make sure we keep it as confidential as we can, but we'll also make sure that you're not retaliated against, because we want you to report these incidences so we can stop them from occurring, right? And unfortunately, sometimes you need to have the reporting to know what's going on. But again, when it's retaliated against, that's when you're going to have people that are scared to come talk to you, okay? So retaliation is forbidden across the board from a lot of different angles. So by you, the manager, it's forbidden to be retaliated by the alleged harasser, okay? By any other supervisor or coworker, against the person complaining or investigating, right? So you can have someone investigating in a complaint, and now they're getting in trouble because they're participating, and they're getting ridiculed for something or getting written up for little things, right? So we want to make sure that we're not retaliating. We're looking at all these different scenarios and relationships. And there could be two people that have a close relationship, right? And someone complained. So retaliation kind of comes full circle sometimes. You have to make sure that you're looking at all angles before you have an adverse impact on someone. How do you succeed at retaliation? Sometimes these are the easiest because of the documentation. And for this one, it's not on the employer to prove. Thank goodness, right? This one actually lies in the hands of the employee. And so for retaliation, the employee has to prove that there was the adverse employment action, that there was that protected activity, which is a complaint, for example, of sexual harassment in this case, and that that adverse action and that protected activity are linked. So the employer does not have to prove it, the employee does. And that's a relief for us because you can have some really good documentation on your end and the employee has nothing and they're the ones that's gonna have to prove it, right? Doesn't mean you don't want to document on your end, but just remember the employee is the one that has to prove this. So how do we avoid this? Obviously, educating what it is, what to look for. Providing a confidential way for employees to complain is another good way because then there will be no retaliation, right? Make it clear that you will not tolerate it. Remember that a suit can be filed if you fail to act. So failing to do anything could be a sign of retaliation. So if you get a complaint and you do nothing about it, there could be something there. So that's why we always want to follow up on something big or small. And then obviously making sure that when we do have an adverse impact or we're disciplining someone who has made a complaint, making sure that it's not perceived as that. And that may mean documentation. You might have to really explain to the person, hey, I know you complained about Amy a week ago, but this write-up for you being late has nothing to do with that, right? It has to do with you being late. And we've talked about this several times, okay? So that's where documentation is very important. And obviously you want to document performance problems, right? Any kind of complaints, what you've done, transfers, to show that you're not retaliating, okay? Show the business reason for why you're making this adverse action or why there's a performance problem. And remember, there's no requirement to give special treatment. So I think sometimes I did say, sometimes we feel and we do need to give kid gloves, right? Really maybe be a little bit more sensitive. It's really about timing, I think. I think if it's a small little performance problem, right, and someone made a complaint, maybe a week after is not a good time to do it, or 2 weeks after, right? So kind of like the example I just gave, right, of someone late. If it's their first time or, a couple times, maybe it's not the best time to have that conversation because it could be tied to retaliation. So I think a lot of it's timing. And again, a lot of it is having the documentation and making sure the discipline matches the offense, okay? And you've handled it in other ways with other people, the same way with other people, because that's going to show too that you're being fair and consistent. So defenses against retaliation, we talked a little bit more about this training. We're, making sure you're educated, you're providing this periodic sexual harassment training. Your defense also is that the employee did not suffer that tangible employment action. And for you to prove that, again, you exercise reasonable care to prevent that harassment from coming, right? You did your due diligence, and the employee unreasonably failed to report the harassment, right? So those are kind of your defenses that you didn't know about it, but now you do, and so you're obviously conducting an investigation at this point. So when we coach managers, sometimes we feel there's some reluctancy on how they want to approach harassment. They don't want to talk about it. And the reason why is, it is obviously uncomfortable. A lot of it is they don't do it enough, maybe, and they just don't know, and they don't want to say the wrong thing, right? So as managers, the more you do of this, the better you'll be. The more conversations, real conversations outside of harassment you have, you're going to get better. You're going to understand your employees. And it won't feel so awkward or uncomfortable, right? Sometimes we feel like we don't want to get into our employees' business, but I think if you approach it as, hey, I care about you, I want to see you succeed, I've seen you're being a little distant these days, and I've noticed your performance is declining, right? And you're not meeting your deadlines. I'm here to talk if you ever need me, right? It could be as simple as that. We also have the EAP, Employment Employer Assistance Program, that's also a very good tool that you could give to the employees, and that way you're not kind of also having to have uncomfortable conversations, but you're allowing them an outlet to reach out to a professional. So why don't employees sometimes report harassment? Well, a lot of times it's embarrassing, right? You don't want to admit that you're being treated this way, or you're allowing someone to treat you this way. It's risky. You could lose your job, you could lose a promotion. There's a lot on the table, right? So I think this kind of came out with Me Too. Why were people taking so long to report this? And why did they ever say anything? And I know I was kind of like, wow, this has been a long time, but now really understanding it's a big deal, right, to come forward. And, we want to encourage people to come forward, but I think we also need to be empathetic and understanding when maybe they don't right away. And I think all we can do is really encourage it, right? Create that open environment, which is what we're going to talk about right now. So preventing it, we want to have a clear written policy. If you have a handbook with AlphaStaff, we definitely have that in there that's going to outline the different steps on how to prevent and how to handle a complaint and where to go. So you have a policy for one. And the second way is, let's be proactive. And I like to call it a proactive management style. We'll go into a little bit more about that. With your harassment prevention policy, again, with AlphaStaff, you'll have this. It's going to have these characteristics. And this is something that you do want to have if you don't have it, because they're going to look at this. If there's a claim, a lawsuit, you're defending, they're going to say, let me see your prevention policy, right? So it needs to have language like it's illegal, it will not be tolerated, here's our complaint process, we discipline anyone who violates the policy, obviously we're confidential, right? Here's some examples. So it goes into the sexual harassment, the visual, things like that. It says harassment doesn't have to be motivated by sexual, right? It doesn't have to be the sexual harassment that we all know. It could be physical, emotional. It has to have the contact information for the two departments so someone can reach out. And it has the investigative procedure, maybe, hey, come to Amy Brown in HR and we'll get back to you in 7 days. If you don't feel like that's a great follow-up, you can go to the CEO, right? So something like that language. And then lastly, it has the anti-retaliation. No touch policy. How do we feel about this? So I would open the chat now, but I want to wait a little bit. But, there's a lot about let's not touch each other, right? No hugging, no touching on the shoulder, no, and that's a personal, opinion, a personal situation, decision that employers will have to make. But I think if we don't have it, I think a lot of it's just personal space, right? And, statistics show that 1 to 2 feet is kind of where the personal space is allowed, right? Anything closer than that is kind of awkward, uncomfortable, and could be seen as, not acceptable, right? If you don't have a no-touch policy. Also with prevention, we want to talk about training and education. We want to make sure that we give you, the managers, the tools, right? So some information you maybe received for the first time today, so now you're becoming more aware of it. You understand why behind the why, right? And of course, the awareness will make you more, better proactive. You can sense the signs, you can have conversations. It also will create more empathy on your part, so you can have those sensitive, awkward conversations, right? And again, we want to train our managers and supervisors on this section because you guys play a critical role. Now, we're going to train employees on some of the basics that we talked about, what it looks like, what's inappropriate, but what we're training you on is that you're the first line of defense, right? and you're legally liable, and we need to make sure you have the tools on how to investigate, how to report, how to be proactive, right? So that's what we're going to train you on. In regards also to all the other things that we talked about, the definition and things like that. So with managers, of course, if you're going to start having these conversations and you're going to ask questions of your employees, let's say they start showing signs that you think maybe, signs of harassment, right? You want to maintain that trust, right? So as a manager, it's really important for you to do that and create that environment where people can come to you. And that's where we have that proactive management, right? So rather than reacting to it and waiting for someone to come to you, let's be aware, again, of the characteristics of someone's personality, if they're changing, what's going on in their lives, so you know and you can anticipate and you can engage right away, right? And so that way you won't have to be pieces and doing a full-on investigation. Hopefully you're just engaging and putting out that fire or whatever it is before it blows up to something big, right? So that could be with gossip as a perfect example. A lot of gossip in the workplace. You could be talking about, harassment things, or you could just be talking about, gossip in general, what people did for the weekend, and maybe this person I heard got demoted and they're not working as hard and they're complaining about the work and things like that, right? So just knowing that, one, that's not productive, doesn't create that team camaraderie and open environment, but also if it's sexual oriented, it could be a form of harassment. So that's a behavior you should stop right away. Sexual, absolutely inappropriate, but even if it goes into something like politics, things like that, you might just want to curb it. So that way you're not having to put out something later, right? Getting it to be a bigger situation. Obviously, as a manager, being proactive, being aware of your own behavior. If you're participating in jokes and gossip, what does that say about you, right? Your first impression, you're holding people accountable. They're going to look for you to see what can they get away with Amy, right? A little bit more strict? Is she a little bit more, she doesn't follow up on things? She doesn't really hold me accountable, so I could probably push the limit, right? They're going to look to you, and so you want to be aware of your behavior and the conversations that you're having and the behaviors and the way you address situations, right? If you put them out right away, they're going to know that they can't get away with that type of behavior in front of you. Inappropriate dress is another common thing that we hear about where, we don't have a dress code per se, but look at the way people are dressing, right? We have some short skirts, and maybe we have a female that looks like a male and she's getting teased. Is that appropriate, right? In our work environment, we'd rather not have that. Well, as we know, that's not appropriate. You may have to accommodate. You should accommodate, right? So I think the inappropriate dress is basically, again, just having a conversation about, hey, is that the way you want to be perceived, right? You're coming to work every day in a t-shirt, and maybe people will perceive you as being a little bit more casual, maybe not as professional, and maybe I could say lazy, right? Because you're not showing up for the part, right? You're a manager and you're dressing more casual than your employees, right? For an example. So I think it's just having conversations about the actual dress, how it impacts their perceived impression on other people, and then maybe, again, filling out the way the employee is going to receive that feedback, right? And of course, if it is suggestive, and you do have a policy, you can definitely go to that policy and say, hey, appropriate. So this is kind of a situation if you don't have a policy. How can you have some of those conversations? So what is considered offensive, right? We've talked a lot about it. And of course, sex, right? Always sex talk, sex actions. Looks like race is in there a little bit, but as you see, it all has to do with sex and touching, right? Most people feel that's offensive at work. Dating at work is another big question we get a lot. You could have a policy that you're not allowed to date. You could have a policy that says, hey, you can date, but we want to know about it. And if you or your significant other is promoted, one of you will need to, not be reporting to each other, right? You are currently doing so. Because we don't want that to be seen as favoritism, or that could be sexual harassment down the road because you have that line of authority. So I think, again, the dating at work is something where, depending on what your beliefs are and what your policies are, you be a little bit more flexible, but you can also be strict as well. But taking that for what it is, if you're strict, we're there 8 hours a day, right? I mean, at least, probably more so. It's hard not to date at work or meet people while you're working, because that's where we are a lot. So I think having some flexibility there is a little bit more attractive to employees than just making sure that you have conversations with them once they get into a relationship. Stopping inappropriate behavior. What is the most effective way? What do you guys think? What is the most effective way? What is the most effective thing you can do as managers to stop inappropriate behavior? I'll open the chat. I've done a lot of talking. Communication. Talking with employees. Group talk. Whole person aside, perfect. It's communication, right? And so, again, it's all about communication. It's about you being open, honest, asking questions. And this is another new feature that has been encouraged in the training, bystander reporting. We hear a lot about it. And really what we want to do is we want to remind people when we are encouraging them or seeing an inappropriate behavior to say something, right? So the ownership should not just be on you, the manager, right? So maybe in that conversation you have is, hey, I'm one person, and I will tell that person that that was inappropriate behavior, but I give you the authority, right, or the autonomy to say, hey, if you see something that is offensive or inappropriate, you know our guidelines, you know our policy, please say something, right? Or come back to me, but I would prefer if you could do it, right? Because I can't be everywhere. So, 87% of Americans now favor zero tolerance, which obviously is, part of the Me Too, Time's Up movement. But really we need to shift from just turning a blind eye. It's someone else's problem. It's really everyone's problem. And if you see something, say something, kind of like the airport, right? If you see an empty suitcase, go report it, right? No one's near the baggage. We want to make sure we do something about it because we're all responsible for it and reporting it. So again, put it on your employees. Make it a culture of, we really want to make sure that this specific behavior is not happening. So please, if you see inappropriate behavior, report it to us. Part of that is also cooperating. If you're part of an investigation, we ask that you cooperate with us. Give us the details so we can make sure that behavior is not occurring, right? So put some of the ownership back on the employees. It's okay to do that, and I think that's part of the training that also I put in the employee training, right? Making sure they understand that they need to do that. So what do we do when an employee complains? We want to make sure, most importantly, we respond immediately. We try to hold as much confidentiality as we can, and we take them seriously, and we start documenting, right? We want to show empathy. We want to be respectful. It could be a person that we know complains all the time, and it might not even be a legitimate complaint, but let's take them all seriously and give the employee the benefit of the doubt to hear them out, and then afterwards have the conversation of, hey, here's what my investigation came to, and there was no validity to it, right? So here's some of the things you should say. I know it wasn't easy coming forward. Thank you. Before we start, I want to help you, but there's some certain things I may have to ask you as part of the investigation. I'll try to keep them as confidential as I can, right? But I also may have to let other people know, especially HR, things like that, right? So just again, being empathetic, being honest, getting as much information as you can in the first initial conversation, and then explaining to them what happens next, right? So making sure that throughout the investigation you're following up, and the victim is aware that this is not acceptable, and this could be met with discipline up to termination, right? Making sure the offender knows. I hate to say victim, I need to change that, sorry, I shouldn't say that in this day and age, but the accuser, right? And then the offender understands that the act is inappropriate and it should stop immediately, and it has to, right? And then you are committed to making sure that any repeated offenses will be addressed immediately, right? So making sure, again, just all the parties involved, that you're following up, because the worst case is when, especially an accuser, is left thinking, what's going on? I don't know. And they think you're not doing anything, and there you go, you have a retaliation claim, right? So we just always want to make sure we're following up, and we don't have to say, hey, that person was terminated. You don't have to say that. You might want to come back and say, hey, I've taken care of it. They have been disciplined. If it is a termination, obviously the person will probably know because they're no longer there. It's pretty obvious. But don't feel like you have to go back and you're obligated to say that, okay? So when is it time to investigate? These obviously when you have a complaint, right? But if you see, kind of go down the list, there's sudden changes of work performance, workplace. The individual is stressing about complaining. They're saying things aren't changing. There's been a problem, right? So all these times are when it's time to investigate, especially when you get towards the bottom of the list, when you see that an administrative agency is starting to inquire about conditions, or the employer suspects, or you get a notice. Obviously you have to investigate then, but by then it's a little too late, right? You want to get in front of it. So it's really when you should have known or you know about it is when you want to investigate. And don't think all investigations have to be formal. It's not like it has to be this huge production. It could be just a simple conversation with one or two people, and then you find out what happened and you just take care of it. Sometimes though, you start to unravel a big string, right? And it's like, whoa, this involves a lot of people. So you might have to have a more formal investigation that takes a little bit more time. So again, going back to the accuser and saying, hey, I just want to let you know I'm following up on your complaint. And there's a little bit more investigation that I've uncovered some other facts. It's going to take me a little bit more time. I will get back to you in 3 or 4 days, right? And just keeping that promise, right? Following up, keeping them updated, and then making sure to keep that promise and letting them know kind of where you're at. And sometimes they don't need to be resolved without a formal investigation. It could be just a simple, hey, Amy, that behavior was inappropriate. I got a complaint about it. You can't do it again, right? And here's why. And I'm going to document it. So that doesn't need an investigation because maybe you saw it or somebody else saw it and you had an eyewitness, right? So minimizing legal exposure is all about treating people consistently, being fair, addressing the complaints immediately, and really just respect and dignity will keep you out of court, right? Remembering that someone is not always guilty, right? Assuming good intentions and doing a thorough investigation. Those are the type of things that are going to keep you out of, well, they're not going to keep you out, but it's going to minimize, right, the legal exposure. Again, having a written policy, making sure you have a clear procedure for filing a complaint, making sure retaliation is not tolerated, and then training new employees on this, right? So new hires need to be trained on this, as well as retraining, because we forget, we get comfortable, we get busy in our day-to-day, and we need to be educated as adults. Adult learning, they need to be educated. Common mistakes with the investigative process is not taking the complaint seriously. You treat it more like a comment. You don't communicate how serious it is. You do nothing, right? And of course, you don't correct the problem. So those are some big mistakes that employers and or supervisors make that could get them into some hot water, and obviously the liability goes up. So know your company policies. It's really important as managers, and you may not know them at the top of your head. I don't know all my policies either, right? But you know where to go. That's really the most important part, right? Is if somebody has a question for you, hey, I know to go to the handbook, or I know to go to Amy Brown, my HRIM, right? You know where to go and we'll get the answer. It's not making it up, or it's not just assuming. You understand the tools and how to get them. How does HR play into this? Well, HR, depending on your organization, could have a pretty big role. You obviously have my support or your HRIM support. But usually, depending on this, again, the structure, how you want to handle the investigation, they could help with interviewing, talking to witnesses. They could help collecting evidence. They'll hopefully evaluate it, right? What I like to say is the frontline manager kind of does the investigation, talks to people because they know the nuances. They're pretty close to the situation. They're there, right? Especially if you have a remote HR. And then you take all the facts, all the evidence, and present them to HR or your HRIM or your CEO. And that's where we kind of go through and look at them objectively and then take appropriate action, right? And then help document. So it's always good to have someone else look at the evidence, look at what suggestion you're going to make for the consequence or the punishment. don't think you're in this alone, right? Let's get some support. And that usually comes from HR or someone, that you report to. All right, we're in the home stretch, 10 minutes. We're gonna talk a little bit about how to apply all this stuff that we've talked about. So your action plan today, right, the 4 things: zero tolerance. So those behaviors, they may seem innocent, but they can lead to other things. So let's just have zero tolerance on certain behaviors, sex in the workplace, those kind of conversations, right? They just don't belong there. Let's set a good example as a supervisor. Set the bar high, right? This is how you should behave. Investigate, respond, create an urgency, right? Create the solution, help them create a solution if that's the case. And let's educate your employees. Let's train them on, again, here are the guidelines, here are the policies, here's how to behave. If you see or hear something, please report it, please say something, and then, we'll address it right away. So those are kind of the 4 takeaways, right? My test for spotting harassment, it's hard. Sometimes it's hard, right? You ask questions, but you're still not sure. And I always like to say, well, would you act this way in front of your child, right? That's kind of the first test. And if it's like, no, well, that could be harassment, right? That's probably inappropriate. And the next one, would you act this way in front of your parent? Again, probably not, right? So yes or no, and then you can kind of go further. And then, most importantly, if you engage in some type of behavior or a decision, would you want to read that behavior in the newspaper, right? So if someone's pregnant and, you terminate them and they are pregnant and you're thinking, well, it wasn't related to the pregnancy, but it's going to look like that, right? If the person's pregnant, especially if you have no documentation, they're just not a cultural fit. That would be an example of, you would not want to read that behavior in the paper, because someone's going to correlate, wow, that termination most likely had to do with the pregnancy, especially when they had really not a good reason, right? So those are just some things to think about. And when I say spotting harassment, it also could be spotting inappropriate behavior as well. So I'm going to open up the chat box again. Might not get through all these questions, but let's get through some. So apply what we've learned, right? We have two individuals, a cashier, Melissa, and her another cashier, Mark. They're both single, and he's asked her out on a date. What should you do? Did you do anything? Then Melissa said, no, I don't want to go out with you, and no one's complaining. So is that harassment, right? And then change it up a little bit more. Mark is Melissa's immediate supervisor. What changes there? So I know that's a lot to put in a chat, but maybe type out some thoughts there. Should you intervene? Is it considered harassment if he asks her out and she says no? We have no. It's not harassment. Supervisors should not ask out line staff. Absolutely, I agree. If he persists, yes. So the takeaway here is, should you intervene? Probably not. Let's let them, unless you have a dating policy, right? But let's let them do what they want to do. If Mark continuously asks Melissa out, absolutely, yeah, that could be harassment, and you want to talk to Mark, right? And again, if Mark is the manager, absolutely unacceptable, Mark. Sorry, you're not allowed to date your employees. So here's another one. Tom's been with the organization for 4 years. He's great. Everyone loves him. He works with a lot of women, and he calls them his girl, right? The women he works with. He'll occasionally give them hugs. Everyone just likes this environment, not a huge deal. They find that when Tom is at work, people are smiling, they're more productive. What is this a problem? Could be very easily, absolutely, if it goes sour, right? Yeah, so this is tough because, again, I don't want to say this is awesome, right? I encourage this type of environment if it works for you, right? And it seems to be working. But the problem with it is that it only takes one person to find it offensive or to have a complaint. And now, even though Tom has been doing this for so many years, it could get you into some trouble. So maybe it's having a conversation with Tom that, hey, you're awesome. Everyone loves you. I get it. I know you want to call, the women your girl and you give them hugs. We need you to back off a little bit, right? And here's why. We're in an environment where people could perceive it differently. And this is if you have no complaints, right? Let's say everything's working great, but you might just want to have him curb it a little bit, right? You might want to have a conversation like that. If you have a complaint, you definitely want to talk about it, right? So again, it depends on what type of behaviors you want to allow at your environment, at your workplace, right? But it feels good, it sounds good, but it could open yourself up to some liability. So Lisa is assisting. She's new and she's assisting someone through the drive-through. He said something out. This customer said something outrageous to her, threatened her, and it just left her trembling, right? But of course, he's no longer there. She comes to you with this situation, right? This guy through the drive-through. She didn't see him, but he was obviously said something crazy to her and threatened her. What responsibility do you have? Are you responsible? Absolutely, I'm getting yes, you're responsible. And I'm sorry, it's really hard to really engage with more than yes or no with the chat. To attend to her, absolutely. So what I would suggest is talking to Lisa, getting as much information as you can. If she needs time off, if she needs to go home, allow it, right? I mean, unless you're super short-staffed, you know, let her take the day off. I mean, if this was my employee, if I had to jump in and do her job for a couple hours, I would, right? Because I care about Lisa. I want her to be, she's not going to be productive on the line, feeling scared and frazzled after what happened, right? So letting her go for the day and you taking over or having someone else come in, that's going to develop trust on the spot, as someone said, and it's going to go a long way, right? And there may not be anything you can do about it from the threatening thing unless he comes back, but at least you've addressed her situation and you've made her feel good. I mean, she will, I'm sure, appreciate that. That's how you respond. If you ignore it, that's just going to make Lisa feel worse, right? Or that you don't care and she won't come to you for other things. That's what we really want to drive home, right? So Jacqueline's a 1960s airline themed restaurant. Men dress like pilots, women dress like female flight attendants, as what, we're in the 60s, right? They're required to wear a uniform, but one day Ethan says he wants to wear a dress and he demands that he wear that flight attendant uniform that the females wear. How should you respond? And again, I'm sorry, I know it's a chat. You know, should you respond? And I'll throw another one out there for you. What if your customers are complaining, right? How do you handle that? You know, you let Ethan do it, but now you have customers complain. So everyone's saying let him, great. Talk about modifying the outfit. I love it, that's great. Accommodate as best as you can. It's 2019, let him, I love it. Yes, absolutely, right? I mean, unless it's a qualified job, you know, description, a job task, right, that he or she cannot do, it's a uniform. And I think in this day and age, we've heard about Abercrombie and Finch, right, where there was some religious accommodation they had to do, they didn't do, and they got a lawsuit from it. Uniforms are kind of some of the easiest things to accommodate, right? And while it may be uncomfortable, it may not be perceived well with your customers or clients, I think having a conversation with them, if you can, right, about how you encourage that, right? You're a type of environment, you're an employer that encourages people to be what they want to be. You celebrate diversity, right? And so again, definitely want to have that conversation and accommodate. And someone says one uniform for all employees. Absolutely, right? Maybe it's time to take that 1960s theme and just go away with the men and women, the gender, and make it more unisex, right, for today, and modernize it. So I love that answer. That's all I got, guys. Wow, whew, into 2 minutes. 2 minutes early. So I will stay on if anybody wants to stay on and do a chat for questions, because I know there were some questions that out there. I saw one about pregnancy accommodation. And I think some disabilities. So I'm so sorry that I went right to the wire. But if anybody has a question, type it out and I can stay on for a couple more minutes and you know, see what's out there. And of course, HRAMs are there to answer your questions. Before you leave, this is SHRM and HRCI certified. So if you need your credit, please reach out to us today. To get this presentation, you can also reach out to us and we'll send it over to you. And last but not least, I'm really excited about this one. I'm actually on vacation next week, but I'm going to watch this. My fellow friend Carrie, who's awesome, I'm sure a lot of you guys know her, she's going to be talking about telecommuting. And a new trend, guys, right? People are working, I work remote, so it's going to be a really interesting on how to avoid, especially when it comes to wage and hour, right? So please try to check this out. It's next Thursday, 11 a.m., 2 p.m. Eastern, and we'll talk about ways, how to deal with telecommuting and, ways to minimize the risk. So that should be a very interesting one. All right, how do we get the certification? So what I'm going to do at the certification, I'm sorry, you mean this one. Sorry, I know I'm going fast. I'm trying to get everyone through. So this is the HRCI credit, the SHRM credit, and then for the certification for this, you guys, what we'll do is I'll go through the list of who registered, and we'll submit them that way to the appropriate person. Hopefully we can identify, I'm sure we can. And for those that are sitting in a large group, which I know we have some people that are sharing, I'll connect, someone will connect with, the main person, and we'll get the list of who attended. So we'll get certificates out to you guys. Give us a little time because it might, take a little bit, but I'll work in-house with my team to get those out. And I don't know when should we expect them. Let's say a week. How's that? I can't get them out really soon because I have to go through the list. It's probably a lot to create. There was at least 74 people on here, so give us a little bit of time, but we'll definitely get them out to you. And if you don't get it, please reach back out to us if you were here and prove attendance. Thank you guys very much. Sorry we went a little over. Really appreciate your cooperation with the chat, and I look forward to talking to you soon. Have a great day. I'll stay on for a little bit.